Thank you so much for joining me today.
Sure, glad to be here.
Do you want to start just by introducing yourself and why you decided to run?
Sure. My name's Jeff Cohen. By now, people know that I'm the economist running in the race. I take a minute maybe to tell you how I got here. I came here from a lot of different places. I was born in India. My family has a long history with South Asia, and I lived there as a child. And I grew up in downstate Illinois in Urbana, one of 6 kids with a professor dad and a teacher mom, and put myself through school at the University of Chicago, and then settled in Chicago for a music career and an economics career. And then my wife and I moved to Evanston about 25 years ago, where we raised our 3 kids, proud ETHS graduates. So that's kind of how I got here. Why did I get into this race? Because our economy is broken, and I can do something about it. It is my particular skill set. And unlike really anyone else in the race, I've a great deal of experience working both with the federal government and against the federal government on some of the biggest economic and public policy, regulatory and legal issues in the country. And it is with that experience that I look at kind of the topic of the year, which is affordability. Affordability is, Donald Trump thinks that affordability is the topic of the year. And so I didn't see really anyone with that set of, that knowledge base running in the race. So that's why I got in.
So this is the first time that the 9th District has an open competitive race in over a quarter century. It's been continuously represented by Jan Schakowsky. What specific lessons would you take from her tenure in Congress? And then what do you think that you would do differently, whether that's like a policy position difference or how you would approach the office?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess a couple of things come to mind. Jan had a legendary experience with constituent services. Everywhere I go in this district, people tell me that. That is what they remember the most about her service. And I think that's something that's admirable. I think it's something that is not talked about enough in the race, for sure. Another candidate had a great idea, which was, let's get a mobile office and move around this enormous district. I think it's a great idea. I'm going to adopt that one. That's a really good plan. So she was very strong on that. Look, I think that something that if I want to criticize a little bit or critique a little bit, is that, I think with her tenure and her mandate for this district, meaning the no fear of facing a MAGA Republican challenge every 2 years, I would have liked to see more leadership on the national stage in terms of policy, especially economic policy. And that's where I would intend to do something pretty different.
Yeah, you mentioned her long tenure. She's represented this for 28 years by the end of this current term. Before her, Sid Yates was here for 48. Yeah. If you win this seat, how long do you see yourself actually staying? And is there a point where, irrespective of how well a congressperson is doing, it might be time to turn it over and leave it to somebody else?
Yeah, look, I don't know what the magic number is, but I'm going to say 4 or 5 terms for me. I think that, I think you lose your effectiveness after a certain amount of time, and I think it's healthy to have turnover. So I'm a firm believer in term limits there. I would like to see some form of term limits or term limits in the judicial branch for the Supreme Court. But another area that's kind of like term limits, like political reform, that I think is doable, that I'm a huge believer in, is uncapping the House. The House is capped at 435 members. That was set in 1929. And at that time, a representative, was responsible for 220,000 people. As you know, it's about 800,000 now. And that just requires a simple bill. And the idea that we don't expand the House, I think is, I think that idea, the time has absolutely come. But you can tell why it's difficult to do, because sitting Congress people don't want to give up their seat. They don't want to dilute their power. But it is an idea that I'm very interested in.
The district itself is very progressive. You mentioned Jan, and whoever wins this race won't actually have to really worry about a challenge from MAGA Republican. And the Democratic field that you're running with and against largely reflects this. People have very progressive platforms. There's not much immediate daylight between people. What do you think is a policy position that separates you out from the crowd? You've mentioned your focus on economics, but do you feel that there's something that you're on top of or pushing for that no one else in this race is really talking about?
Yeah, there's probably a lot of things. As you said, I mean, I'm a progressive. I think there's no daylight between almost any of us on any of the critical social issues facing this country. I think it's the question of what we think the right solutions are to something like the giant affordability gap. I'll give you a couple, okay? One not controversial, one that maybe is a little more so. I think Democrats are very afraid to talk about tax cuts, and that is the wrong way to think about it. I'm confident as an economist. One of the areas that I think no one else has discussed is I'd like to have a tax incentive for small business, because 40% of us get our paychecks from a small business. I mean, nearly half the country is employed in some form in a small business. I want a federal tax cut that can then be used as a profit pool incentive for employees. It's kind of the same effect as raising the minimum wage, but it's a more efficient, more productive way of sharing the wealth in a business. And that is something that I think no one else is willing to think about. And the reason why I'm so, why that's a very important part of my policy position is that is a bipartisan idea. And that is what we're going to need if we want to get anywhere making a dent on affordability, even if the Democrats win the House in 2026. One that I will say is an economic topic that's also a social topic that I have been somewhat different on than the other candidates, at least in name, is Medicare for All. Medicare for All is something we all should aspire to. There's no question in my mind that the healthcare system in this country is very broken and not nearly good enough, and healthcare is absolutely a right. But to sloganeer it and put a sticker on the back of your car is kind of like lying to voters. It is not going to happen in the next 4 to 6 to 8 years. Why? Because this federal government is way, way too weak. The economy is way too weak to deliver quality health care to people. So when I hear other candidates talk about it, they say Medicare for all, and then some of them go on to explain some of the same things I do, which is the scale and scope economies of achieving that are far from achievable. The differences across other countries that have been able to do it are enormous. And I speak with some confidence about this because of my 30 years in economics, probably 20 is covering the 3 big areas of healthcare: insurance, providers, and the pharmaceutical side. So it is a very complicated problem. There are things we can do to beat down the prices, and we must do those things. But let's not lie to voters about what is actually achievable.
You said that that's going to be impossible to do in the next 4 to 8 years. As a freshman member of Congress in your first 2 years, what are some issues you think that you'll be able to actually push forward and make progress on, understanding you're one member out of 435 and may not immediately have clout or experience or whatever else to, make those pushes in your first term?
Yeah, I'd answer that in kind of 2 ways. Everybody says that you're going to be a freshman, you're not going to have any clout. I think that I'm in a place in my life where a political career is not something I've been ambitious about my whole life. So I am willing to go toe to toe on really anything that I believe in. If you don't like what I'm doing, you can vote me out. But I'm not constrained by this need to stay in the seat. So I intend to be a loud, firm voice. This district needs a loud, firm voice. And as I said before, there's a mandate here. We should be using that every single day in the House. The Illinois 9th representative should be on the news at 9 a.m. every day giving a press conference. So all of my platform, if you go on my website, there's tons of this. It starts with the idea that the way to get underneath the this intractability in the next 2 years is with bipartisan ideas. So I mentioned a tax cut for small business. That would be one. I think the mortgage interest deduction needs to be available for those who want to take the standard deduction. That would be a huge boost to first-time homeowners. That's bipartisan. Revamping the FDA to speed up the clinical trials process. We can get drugs developed quite a bit faster. We saw that through COVID than we have now. That would be something that's bipartisan. We've got to fund the BLS. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is kind of the roadmap for the world's economy. That would be something bipartisan. So I use the economy as a wedge to get underneath folks in the interim couple of years to make some progress.
Yeah, talking about bipartisanship, both chambers of Congress are currently controlled by Republicans, and there are significant splits in the Democratic caucus. Putting aside specific issues you feel could be bipartisan, just from an approach standpoint, how would you work or deal with Republicans to try to, bring them on board with, working with a Democrat from such a progressive district? And how would you do the same thing with other Democrats that you may diverge with?
Yeah, I think it is the economy. I mean, it's topics of affordability, because affordability no political party bounds. When there was this discussion at the end of last year about whether the ACA subsidies, which should not be called subsidies, they should be called economic reality for folks, when those were subject to getting cut, I think the Democrats kind of blew the PR opportunity, which was 5 states that cared about them the most are 5 deeply red states. When those Congress people go back to their constituents, they're going to get screamed at when everyone realizes their health care just tripled. So it's really using common ground on kitchen table economics, where I think you can find a way to get through to folks. I think some of that's temperament. I grew up in a place where a lot of people voted for Trump. I have friends who voted for Trump. I don't agree with it, but I have a pretty solid understanding of why they did. And, Congress is a team sport, and I've played a lot of team sports. You kind of need to have that mindset to get people on board. You asked about getting to the left, too. I think, a good example would be someone like, he's not in Congress, but, Memdani ran on affordability. He called it rent. And that is affordability of folks living in New York City. So there's, that is the lever on the far left too, I think.
And kind of turning the question around, where would you draw the line on what you're willing to compromise, negotiate, and reach across the aisle for, and where you can't compromise, this is a non-starter, kind of have to stand on where you believe it?
Yeah, so if you said to me, could you compromise on, say, how much a transportation funding bill should, be in the next budget? Yeah, I could probably compromise on that. Could I compromise on something like women's reproductive freedom? Absolutely not. Could I compromise on that healthcare is a right for everyone? Absolutely not. Do I think climate change is, an existential threat? Yes, and I will not compromise on that. So I think, there are certain things that I'm just not going to compromise on. The financial stuff, I know the ins and outs well, so there may be ways to move things there over different time horizons or budgets. But, just implicit in your question is, I think someone who is not there for a career has the ability to stand firm where I think others may not. I mean, the one thing you can be sure of is I will not compromise some decision based on my desire to stay in a seat.
And you do feel like, getting back to what we talked about earlier, like imagining you probably won't stay any longer than 4 or 5 terms, like that's going to factor into how you work with people. Like, look, you can't, try to get me to go one way or the other because I want to stay here forever. Like, you're there to do what you want to do in the time you have. Like, can you kind of speak more to that? Like,
yeah, I think you said it better than I would say it. I mean, that's right. I want to make a difference in a decade. I'm not going to play some long game so that I can stay in the seat for 25 years. I mean, that's just not part of who I am. I don't think it's healthy for democracy.
And part of the issue with the current kind of space of bipartisanship is that the parties are not frequently actually acting in good faith with each other, actually coming to the table and negotiating in a way that they're going to follow through on. How do you expect to build meaningfully good faith negotiations in the current environment of Congress that you'd be dealing with?
Well, you gotta tell the truth. You gotta tell the truth. And like I said, I am willing to hold people to tell the truth in a way that may feel, strong or argumentative, because like I said, if you don't like what I'm doing, you can vote me out. I'm less willing to see through, can I say, the bullshit that people on both sides, absolutely including Democrats, are willing to stand because their lives are bound up in being a congressperson. My life is not bound up in that. It just isn't.
So kind of getting at your experience as an economist, you mentioned that you've worked for and against the federal government at various times, but this is your first time running for any elected office. You are running in a field that has numerous people who have held or hold offices at different levels of government. So why should voters value that experience as an economist above others' experience in other areas like elected office or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think, I'm not going to denigrate being a state senator or state representative. I think those are certainly valuable experience. But I think it's pretty different being a state rep in a blue state dealing with the kinds of problems that are not federal than it is having experience understanding how the Department of Justice really works, how the FTC really works, how the IRS really works, how the Securities and Exchange Commission works, what will fly in those agencies, especially when we're not talking about tens of millions of dollars or even hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars on the table. That is my experience. And a lot of what I'm concerned about is the way that, and maybe we'll get to this, the way that competition is going to take place, especially in the world of AI and healthcare. And I've spent my life working on understanding how competition takes place, what will be good for consumers, what will be bad for consumers. A state legislator has none of that in their background. And so when we decide what the next AI is going to be in this country, I would think you'd want someone on the Commerce Committee and the Science Technology Committee who's actually seen those revolutions take place before and can help guide them, because we definitely need guidance there. But that is not something that I think most state house legislators have, much experience with.
Yeah, turning it around, do you feel that your work as an economist does prepare you for the work of a legislator as well? Like, do you feel you would be able to enter Congress, hit the ground running, and be able to pick up that work based on that experience with federal agencies, but not having been in the legislative role?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because a lot of the work that I've done is actually in connection with legal work. So my understanding of the law is pretty deep. A lot of people think I'm a lawyer when I'm at a cocktail party or something. I can fake that because I've spent so much time working on the economic piece of legal issues. So I know how laws are written. I know what how bills get achieved. And I should add, because of that, when I've done work in the court system, when I've testified, a lot of that work's in front of juries, and being able to explain facts to juries, I think is a little like being able to explain facts to legislators. You're there to show them the facts and try to get them to understand it a certain way. That's what it's going to be like to bargain with folks across the aisle.
You've said at forums and throughout the campaign that all of these social issues that we talked about that may not have much daylight between the candidates, all of them are undergirded by the economy, right? That's been the main thrust of your campaign. But as the campaign has primarily focused on social issues of, say, immigration, ICE, democracy, et cetera, how do you feel you can convince voters that, as all this other stuff is going on, what we really need to be focusing on is the economy? What's your pitch to say, I know that this is drawing your attention elsewhere, but here's where we actually really need to be focusing?
Yeah, so let me be clear. There are some, I don't agree with all economists. I certainly don't think I'm right about everything. Economists can be wrong for sure. And I feel very strongly about some social issues that have nothing to do with the economy. So ICE is, there is an underlying labor context to immigration that is really important. But the idea that ICE is, a bankrupt, morally bankrupt organization, that's not really the economy. That's terrible, terrible leadership. And, I've been in business, I've run companies, I know a lot. I could say something about leadership, and boy, that is an organization that needs to just be stripped to the core. We need to rebuild it to focus on, bad guys who shouldn't be here. But that's not what they've been doing. So I guess to your question, there are some things that, of course, need attention that don't really have to do with the economy. But the social rift that you saw in Minneapolis, when people are hurting, and not doing well and feel like there's no economic hope, that's the rift that Donald Trump exploited, right? And so there's hatred there, but there's also hatred that comes about from, economic depression.
So thinking about the campaign itself, your pre-primary report shows that you entered the final weeks with about $500,000 on hand, supported by self-loans, but you have significant ground to cover in building name recognition and support among this very crowded field. How are you connecting with voters right now, and what do you see as your path to victory in this race?
Yeah, so look, we are knocking on doors 10 hours a day. It is a campaign that's built on all the traditional kind of ways of getting out the vote. I don't know the exact statistics, but our social media presence is, I won't say it's second to none, because I think we have a candidate who specializes in that. But we have a lot of social media traction. I mean, millions of views on some of the things I've talked about in terms of the economy. So we feel good about that. And of course, the economy keeps coming back as the topic, and that is what we want to connect with voters on: phone calling, mailing. I'm not going to litter your mailbox with flyers. That's not something I believe in doing. But we have a personal letter writing campaign out there, and knocking on doors, and getting the word out.
So mail ballots have been coming back in for a couple weeks now. Local early voting is open at Robert Crown and other sites around Cook County. As people are making their decision in this race over the next week or so, what's one thing you want them to keep in mind?
Look, if you want to fix the economy, you got to send an economist. I mean, that is the bottom line. I think you maybe have said this before, but I'm the only economist running for Congress in the country. And I don't think we're always right, but that seems like a problem. I think we could use a few more of us. And affordability has, been my go-to point since day one, because it's not a talking point for me. So I would really hope that people can connect. If that's what's most on their mind, please connect that with my name on the ballot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.